This is for Palestine, Ramallah, West Bank, Gaza. This is for the child that is searching for an answer. This is not just a war over stolen land. Why do you think little boys are throwing stones at tanks? And we'll never really know how many people are dead. They drop bombs on innocent girls while they sleep in their bed. Israel is a terror state, they're terrorists that terrorize. I'll testify my television, televise them telling lies. How many more resolutions have to be violated? How many more children have to be annihilated? This is not a war, it is systematic genocide. But whatever they try, Palestine will never die. Free, free Palestine! Free, free Palestine! Free, free Palestine! Free, free Palestine!
Hello, I'm Chris Williamson and welcome to the latest edition of Palestine Declassified on Press TV, where we investigate the Israeli regime's global war against solidarity with the illegally occupied people of Palestine. Images from the war in Ukraine have dominated the headlines over the last few weeks. But the Jewish identity of Ukraine's President Zelensky has been used by many in the West to cover NATO's clear alliance with neo-Nazi battalions in the war against Russia. But it's not just NATO that's working with these neo-Nazi groups in Ukraine. Israel is arming, and its military personnel are even fighting alongside explicitly neo-Nazi units. To find out more, I'll be speaking to a couple of experts after this report from Bianca Rahimi.
As the battle for Ukraine rages, we ask about the involvement of the Zionist regime in the conflict and any affinities between neo-Nazi currents in the Ukrainian military and the racist ideas inherent in the Zionist movement. The Zionist regime has supplied arms to the Ukraine military, including the Nazi Azov Battalion. Azov Battalion members have been photographed toting Tivor rifles built by Israeli Military Industries, a subsidiary of Elbit Systems. In 2018, it was revealed that a Ukrainian military training school website indicates that training is provided by former Israeli Defense Force officers. Israelis have been confirmed as joining the fight against Russia, and Ukrainian Zionists from the extremist Chabad Lubavitch sect have also signed up with the Ukraine military. The neo-Nazi Azov Battalion reportedly included a number of Jewish recruits. But the connections with Zionism go much deeper. Numerous prominent Zionists hailed from the Ukraine, including 2 former chiefs of the Israel Defense Forces and 5 presidents or prime ministers of the Zionist entity. Odessa in southern Ukraine has been referred to as the Gates of Zion. For example, the revisionist Zionist leader Vladimir Jabotinsky hailed from Odessa. Jabotinsky historically supported the Ukrainian nationalists, including their leader Simon Petliura. Zionist sources today credit Petliura with responsibility for the deaths of 50,000 Jews in the pogroms in the 1920s. But Jabotinsky maintained that Petliura was not an anti-Semite, even going so far as to state, "When I die, you can write on my grave, this was the person who signed an agreement with Petliura." Following the Western-sponsored coup in Ukraine in 2014, a school was named after Jabotinsky in Odessa in 2016. The Ukrainian nationalists under Stepan Bandera collaborated with the Nazis in the 1939 to 1945 war. Today he is revered by the Ukrainian far right. The openly Nazi Azov Battalion has now been incorporated into the Ukrainian armed forces. Much has been made of the fact that the president of the Ukraine, Zelensky, is Jewish, with the implication that he would not collaborate with Nazis. In fact, Zelensky is the protege of a powerful Ukrainian oligarch, Igor Kolomoisky. Kolomoisky, who has both Ukrainian and Israeli citizenship, owned Privatbank, a company from which he is accused of looting more than $5 billion. Zelensky was the beneficiary of a network of shell companies set up to send cash from Kolomoisky offshore. Kolomoisky set up his own militia in 2014 and also funded the neo-Nazi Azov Battalion. Zelensky has ceded power to the far right in Ukraine and now depends on them as front-line fighters. On March 1st, Zelensky again showed the practical alliance with the far right by appointing Colonel Maxim Marchenko as the new governor of Odessa. Marchenko was the commander of the neo-Nazi Adar Brigade, accused of Daesh-style war crimes in 2014. As we have seen in this report, the Zionist regime and its supporters are intimately involved in Ukraine. Both historically and now, the Zionist movement is allied with the Ukrainian far right.
We're joined today by the British-Iraqi hip-hop artist and activist who's a patron of the Stop the War Coalition. Loki's also the host of the Watchdog podcast on Mint Press, which investigates secretive organisations and powerful vested interests. We'll hear from Loki in a moment. Our resident expert, David Miller, will also be giving us the benefit of his insights. David's an academic and former professor at Bristol University and a leading scholarly critic of Israel. He co-founded and is a co-director of the lobbying watchdog initiative Spinwatch. Welcome to the show. Loki, can I start with you? Can you tell us what's the relationship between Zelensky and the far right?
Well, essentially, Zelensky has overseen the integration into the Ukrainian state of several explicitly neo-Nazi movements. He awarded towards the end of the last year the Hero of Ukraine Award to one of the main fighters from the Right Sector organization, which is one of the Banderite organizations. In addition to that, he appointed as advisor to Commander-in-Chief of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, Dmitry Yurosh, another very visible fighter from the right sector. As was mentioned, he has appointed as the governor of Odessa, one of the Ida battalion, and overall what we see here is a push to really put the Ukrainian state at the need of these major neo-Nazi groups.
Interesting, yeah. I mean, David, people talk about the fog of war, don't they? And an example of this is that Ukraine can't possibly have a problem with Nazis because the president is Jewish. What do you say to that?
I would say, let's look back at his inaugural speech when he became president. And in the official translation on the government website, he talks about Ukraine becoming like Israel and defending its native land. Now, of course, that's a very strongly Zionist thing to say, but it also points out the strong confluence there is between Zionist ideas and Ukrainian nationalist ideas. These are far-right ideas which depend on an ethno-conception of the state. And of course, these work very well with the far right. So Zelensky himself, yes, he's Jewish. He's also strongly oriented towards Israel, but that in itself is a sign of being oriented really towards the far right. And the evidence as Loki's just been saying, is that he has moved towards the far right. He's tried politically to distance himself from them, but in practice he depends on them as frontline fighters.
Right. Loki, I mean, I wonder whether you could explain for our viewers what the relationship is between Zelensky and this oligarch, Igor Kolomoisky.
Well, Igor Kolomoisky, a triple citizen, even though it's illegal in Ukrainian law, of Ukraine, Cyprus, and the Israeli regime. He's also a citizen of that entity. Now, he was the backer of the TV shows which Zelensky was a major star of, and he was able to take him from being that star to his landslide victory in the presidential election of 2019. He was the top funder of Zelensky. Now, what's interesting is in addition to funding Zelensky, Igor Kolomoisky funded the Azov battalion and the Ida battalion as well at the same time, essentially. The period of thrusting Zelensky in front of the masses on TV, Kolomoisky was also funding these explicitly right-wing and neo-Nazi groups.
Interesting. I mean, David, there's a lot of people on the left are saying words to the effect that, look, there's Nazis everywhere, so we shouldn't get hung up with a few Nazis in Ukraine. I mean, how do you respond to that?
Well, I've heard people say that. I've heard them say, look, the Nazis in Spain are doing well in the elections. Certainly there's Nazis in Russia, and there are Nazis in this country too, but none of them are in government. None of them are in prime positions in the military, in the police. The Azov Brigade's street army is deployed alongside the national police across the Ukraine. And this is an army of thugs, which is there to intimidate anyone who steps out of line. And that means, of course, people who are seen to be Russian or pro-Russian. It probably also means, and it has been in terms of their ideology, Jews too, although, of course, there are some Zionists who are fighting on the other side.
Interesting, yeah. And Loki, is there a precedent for NATO, or even Israel for that matter, associating so closely with neo-Nazis? I mean, it seems extraordinary.
Well, I think the key point that was mentioned in the clip that you showed was about Vladimir Jabotinsky. This is not some minor fringe figure within the Zionist movement. There is no other figure in Zionist history who has more streets, more hotels, more cinemas, more parks, more schools named after them within occupied Palestine 48 than Vladimir Jabotinsky. Now, his followers went on to be the Stern Gang, the well-known terrorist organization that targeted British soldiers and Palestinians, of course, more. Well, in 1941, and this is historical fact, the Stern Gang wrote a letter to the Nazi government of Germany offering to enter the war on the Nazi side and supporting the Madagascar plan. There is a long history of this intertwining of the idea, as Theodor Herzl put it, that the anti-Semites of Europe will be the best friends of the Zionist movement because they will provide the Zionist movement with the human material through which the state can be built. It doesn't matter how people feel about it, these are historical facts about how we came to be where we are today.
Sure. That's really interesting, fascinating insight, Loki. And I wonder as well, the question I'd just like to ask you is, what do you think explains why Israel's arming the Azov battalion with these Teva rifles? I mean, is it facing any kind of pushback for that?
Well, when you look at the general NATO policy of pumping Ukraine full of weapons since 2014, Poroshenko, the president after the coup, the US-backed coup, said publicly on TV, he thanked the Swedes, the British and the Americans for sending the weapons. NATO nations were generally pumping this area full of weapons in order to draw the Russian state into a quagmire. So when the Israeli regime sends the Tavor rifles to Azov, they are merely part of this general push which is taking place.
Yeah, it's certainly a tangled web. And well, thanks very much indeed, both of you, for that. But we'll come back for a further discussion shortly after this video about the mysterious Chabad Lubavitch sect that's active in Ukraine as well as occupied Palestine.
They gathered from all corners.
Chabad Lubavitch is an ultra-Orthodox Jewish sect with more than 10,000 emissaries in 100 countries worldwide. There are 52 centers in Ukraine and around 150 emissaries. Chabad is a dominant force in the Jewish community in Ukraine. Dnipro, Ukraine is the home to the largest Chabad, indeed the largest Jewish center in the world. Its benefactor was Ukrainian oligarch Igor Kolomoisky. But what is Chabad Lubavitch? Founded in the small Russian town of Lyubaveki near the border with Belarus, it is a messianic sect which believes Jews are the chosen people. According to Haaretz, Chabad's key religious text state that non-Jews have only animal souls, not human souls. It runs a children's group called the Army of Hashem, which in the words of the leader of the sect, the Rebbe who died in 1994, is dedicated to waging war against non-Judaism. The supremacism of Chabad is nowhere more evident and pointed than in its activities in Palestine. A book called The King's Torah, written by two Chabadi rabbis from the notorious Yitzhar illegal settlement, justifies the killing of Palestinian children. It's not just words either. Chabad Lubavitch is heavily involved in the furthest extremes of the settler movement in Palestine. Chabad Lubavitch opposes returning any land at all to Palestinians, and according to the Zionist intelligence agency Shin Bet, almost all price tag revenge attacks on Palestinians are carried out by followers of the sect. Chabad has links with the movement of the extremist Rabbi Meir Kahan, whose organization, the Jewish Defense League, was designated as a terrorist organization by the FBI. Chabad was reportedly implicated in funneling money from the US to Israel for Kahane. Today, it is deeply implicated in alleged fraud and embezzlement by Ukrainian oligarch Igor Kolomoisky. The Department of Justice has filed 4 separate actions against Kolomoisky, who is banned from entering the US. 2 Chabad leaders are specifically named in the charges. Given this history, it's no surprise that Chabad Lubavitch is integral to the events in Ukraine and is aligned with the far-right Ukrainian nationalists.
Well, that's another illuminating video, David. What can you tell us about this mysterious Chabad Lubavitch sect and what's its role in the Zionist movement?
It performs a very interesting role. They have this thing called shluchim, which is a word for emissaries, and they send emissaries all around the world. They have 10,000 of them, they say, in 100 countries. And the role of the shluchim is to encourage people to return to Jewish religious practice and to return to certain forms of Orthodox practice. And it's used as a way of bringing people into to Zionism by encouraging religious observance, even for non-Orthodox Jews. In a way, it's a funny thing because they don't really regard Reform and liberal and progressive Jews as being real Jews, and it's an extraordinary sort of thing. But it's used to proselytize for the Zionist movement as well as for Orthodox Judaism, and it's of course leaned on by the Zionist movement more properly known. The Jewish Agency, for example, has adopted the same term, shluchim, for its emissaries, and it sends emissaries from Israel all across Britain and all across many other Western countries. And so it's used as a kind of cutting edge for expanding the influence of Zionism, even although it appears simply to be a religious organization.
Interesting. I mean, even the infamous Zionist intelligence agency Shin Bet seems skeptical about Chabad Lubavitch. I mean, why do you think its role in revenge attacks on Palestinians isn't better known? I mean, very few people need to be aware about this.
It's a truly extraordinary story, isn't it? These are people who are involved in daily attacks and humiliations of Palestinians. It's well known in Palestine that this is the case. The Zionist press regularly talks about it, and many of the things in the report you've just seen, the quotes come from Zionist press articles. But outside of Palestine, it's regarded as being a sort of cuddly and interesting Jewish local organisation which will bring you in for a Shabbat supper and will be nice to the local Jews and indeed to non-Jews. But actually, you know, when you look a little bit deeper, the theology underlying this, you saw that in the clip just there, the idea of a war against non-Judaism. It's a little bit frightening when people begin to think of that, how that might relate to the attacks on Palestinians, but also how that might relate to the views of this organisation in terms of people in this country. So it's extremely surprising, really, when you see this, that hardly anybody in this country has any idea that this is the kind of organisation it is.
Well, hopefully what we're doing today will have illuminated a few more people. But look, I mean, the FBI's banned the Ukrainian oligarch Kolomoisky and his family from the US and named 2 senior Chabad leaders as being intimately involved in his alleged looting and fraud in the United States. But how does that relate, do you think, to the conflict in Ukraine?
Well, the money, over $5 billion, it's said, was looted by Kolomoisky from a bank. This is only from the bank we're talking about. And it was done by a network of shell companies, which President Zelensky also benefited from. But these 2 guys, the Chabad guys in Florida, who've taken millions and millions of dollars, spread it around real estate and spread it around Chabadi charities in New York and indeed in Florida. This has been a means to get the money out of Ukraine. So it's been a means which has contributed to the destabilization of Ukraine. So that's one way in which it has contributed. But it's also contributed in the sense that Kolomoisky is absolutely central to the encouragement of the neo-Nazis and the pursuit of the power of President Zelensky. So there's a very strong connection here between the Chabad movement, which of course is supported in the Ukraine by Kolomoisky, and the whole neo-Nazi question. So these are very closely connected, and you know, truly extraordinary as a picture of what's happening in Ukraine now.
Absolutely. I mean, Loki, I wonder whether you could sum up for us how you think this Kolomoisky network relates to NATO's activities in Ukraine.
Well, essentially, since 2008, at least, at the Bucharest summit, you had NATO put very clearly in their conclusions that Ukraine would join the alliance. This is black and white and available on the NATO website. When you look at this funneling of money into building up what would become the bulwark of the Ukrainian state against Russia, then you see quite clearly how Kolomoisky and NATO's interests have intertwined. It's also important to point out that historically it's been said that if we were to list every single former Nazi that worked with NATO, that was sort of subsumed into NATO following World War II, it would take something like 3,000 pages. For example, you look at Sidney Gottlieb and his innovative work in terms of torture and developing MK Ultra. It took place with a team of Nazi doctors and scientists. There's so many other examples of the way in which US policy has integrated into it Nazi figures. So really, this is not a historical aberration at all.
No, indeed. I mean, what do you think the end game is here, though? I mean, this is
what it seems to me.
We're on the precipice, aren't we, potentially of a third world war here? I mean, so, you know, what on earth is going on?
Well, you have a few contradictions happening. On one hand, if the United States has separated Russia off from Europe, essentially, meaning that US companies will benefit massively from now being the source of gas for Europe. They have sidelined the Nord Stream pipeline, which was a major objective of US companies, no doubt. But then also, in addition to that, they seek in the long term to, through these sanctions, bring down the Russian government and either balkanize Russia or potentially, it's been said in recent days, integrate Russia into NATO itself. The other side, which may harm US interests, is of course when you push something like 3 billion people in Russia, India, and China towards each other to trade in currencies other than dollars. What you have is quite serious ramifications economically for the United States. So it's quite a short-sighted policy, I would say.
I mean, those economic ramifications, David, I mean, they're also going to be felt potentially very acutely in Europe, aren't they? Have the political leaders taken leave of their senses? I mean, they're imposing these sanctions, but I've seen various commentators say that these are going to blow back on European citizens, on British citizens, with higher energy prices, higher food prices, and potential shortages of both. I mean, is the truth in that? What do you think?
That's right. I mean, it will blow back. It will blow back in that sense, in the economic sense. It will lead to hardship in this country. Fuel prices will increase, and that will be a significant effect. There will be blowback in terms of the neo-Nazis, of people who've gone to fight there, who come back to this country and will commit to attacks like it's been the case in the past, where the Ukrainian terrorists in this country have killed people, including, for example, the well-known campaigner Mas Salim. Her father was killed by a Ukrainian neo-Nazi. But also, I think the other question, which Karim touched on, is that this is about the possibility of ending a unipolar world. You push those people together, maybe they'll be joined by Venezuela, Iran, by Bolivia, by Cuba, and then you've got the beginnings of the end of US empire. Once the SWIFT payment system, which has now been stopped in Russia, Russia's excluded from that, they will have to develop alternatives. Alternative internet, if they're censored, and that's going to lead potentially to the possibility of an emerging alternative power base which will challenge the US empire much more pointedly than this conflict has.
I mean, briefly, Loki, what do you think the future is then for the petrodollar as a result of this?
Well, I think it's inevitable that you will see major ramifications depending on what happens in Ukraine. I think that if you were right now sitting in the United States, what you would want was to increase this period of time. You know, Hillary Clinton actually put it this way: we are looking at the Afghanistan model. And when she means the Afghanistan model, she's talking about 1979, when the United States were able to draw the Soviet Union into occupation of Afghanistan. So really, they are working for a long-term goal, which I think will be hard for them to achieve, no matter how many javelin pieces of weaponry that they send in there, or the Thales Star Streak. No matter how they try to encourage this quagmire, I don't think it's going to go on for quite as long as they hope it will. So it may well backfire.
Okay, well listen, thanks very much, both of you, David and Loki, for your illuminating insights. Unfortunately, we are out of time. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, and please do continue to follow the show on social media. We'll be back next week with more news and analysis, so until next time on Palestine Declassified, bye for now.